All right, so you wanted a deep dive into Lori Vallow Daybell. Well, you got it. We're talking about Lori Vallow Daybell and that recent interview she gave from prison. I mean, it's pretty wild stuff. You sent over some articles about it, including one called Lori Vallow Daybell, Prison Interview and Exoneration Claims.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique situation. It's not every day you hear a convicted murderer claiming they'll be exonerated,
Yeah.
especially when it's based on visions from Jesus.
Right. So, okay, before we get into Lori's interview, let's just do like a really quick refresh on the case for everyone. Back in September 2019, Lori's two children, Tylee and JJ, they vanished. And months later, their remains were found buried on Chad Daybell's property, Chad, of course, being Lori's husband.
Right, and Chad himself was also under investigation for the death of his previous wife, Cammie. Initially, her death was considered natural causes, but later it was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation.
So incredibly tragic, and the whole conspiracy element just makes it even more intense. Lori was actually convicted of conspiring to kill Tammy.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. And on top of that, Lori is still awaiting trial in Arizona for charges related to the death of her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, and even the attempted murder of her niece's ex-husband.
Wow. It's like every time you think you have a grasp on this case, some new crazy detail comes out. But let's fast forward to today. Lori's giving her first televised interview from prison, and she's claiming she and Chad will be exonerated.
And she's basing this on visions she claims to have had while in heaven, where Jesus showed her a future where she and Chad were in prison.
It's a pretty bold claim, to say the least. I mean, how do you even begin to process that? You're convicted of murder, your husband is on death row, and you're talking about exoneration based on divine intervention.
Yeah, it's a really jarring contrast. It definitely raises a lot of questions like, what could be the psychological factors at play here? Is it a coping mechanism? A form of denial? I mean, is it so profound that it actually allows her to function despite the evidence?
Those are great questions, and ones I'm sure the families of the victims are struggling with. I mean, can you imagine hearing the person responsible for the loss of your loved one talking about being exonerated because of something like this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The impact of these statements on the families who've already suffered so much, it has to be devastating. Yeah. To have Lori, who was found guilty by a jury, claiming innocence because of some kind of vision, that's got to be really hard to hear.
You know, the article you shared includes some quotes from Lori, and they really highlight this unshakable belief she has. At one point, she says, these are fascinating stories, when she's discussing her situation and Chad facing the death penalty.
I know, to describe something so serious and tragic. It's fascinating. It's fascinating in itself. It really raises questions about her emotional state.
Yeah.
And how she's processing this whole situation.
Then there's another quote where she just doubles down. She says, the same way I will be exonerated, we will both be exonerated in the future. It's almost like she's totally detached from the legal proceedings and living in this completely alternate reality.
Yeah, that unwavering conviction. Despite all the evidence against her, it's one of the most perplexing parts of this whole case. It really suggests a level of denial or delusion that's difficult to grasp.
And she goes on to explain this belief by saying, I have seen things in the future that Jesus showed me when I was in heaven, and we were not in jail, and we were not in prison, and they were still in the future from now.
And that's where the case really takes a turn. It goes beyond just legal arguments and enters this realm of faith and personal belief.
Exactly. It makes you wonder what exoneration even means to her in this context. Is it about being legally vindicated, or is it something more spiritual? Is she talking about being seen as innocent in the eyes of God, regardless of what earthly courts decide?
It's a deep question, and it really gets at the heart of how complex this case is. It's this collision of legal realities, personal beliefs, and this search for meaning in the face of unimaginable tragedy.
It really is. And this Dateline episode isn't just about Lori. It features interviews with a bunch of other people connected to the case too, including Lori's son, Colby Ryan, retired FBI agent Doug Hart, and even some of the detectives involved in the investigation.
Yeah, hearing from those different perspectives is going to be really interesting, especially Colby's insights. As Lori's only surviving child, his understanding of his mother's personality and her behavior, it could be really valuable in helping make sense of her actions and statements.
Absolutely. So for you listening to this deep dive, think about this. How do these claims of divine intervention and future exoneration sit with you?
It's important for all of us to consider the potential impact of faith and personal belief on a situation like this. You know, it raises questions about how we reconcile individual convictions with the legal system and the pursuit of justice in general.
So in the article, there was also a mention of another podcast, Mommy Doomsday, which also looks into this case. But before you go running off to listen to that, Let's unpack some more of what Lori's saying, because it really does offer a fascinating glimpse into her state of mind.
You know that quote where Lori called Chad possibly getting the death penalty? Fascinating stories. I don't know, it
Hmm.
just seems so detached,
Yeah.
especially considering what they're facing.
Right. It's really hard to wrap your head around that kind of language. When you think about what's actually happening, it makes you wonder about her emotional state and how she's really seeing all of this.
Yeah, it's like she's observing it all from a distance, like it's a book or a movie instead of her own life.
It's a really fascinating look into her psychology. And it makes you think, is this detachment another coping mechanism? A way to shield herself from how overwhelming this must all feel?
Oh, that's a good point. It kind of goes along with what we were talking about before,
Oh.
about how strongly she believes that they'll both be exonerated. It's like she's built up this wall around herself,
Yeah.
one that's reinforced by her faith and her belief in some kind of divine intervention.
And she really emphasizes that in another quote. She says, "The same way I will be exonerated, we will both be exonerated in the future." It's not just a casual comment. It's her stating that she's absolutely certain about what's going to happen, even though it goes against everything that's happened legally.
And that certainty is what I think a lot of people struggle with. How can she be so sure when there's so much evidence that she's already been convicted? It really makes you think about how much someone's beliefs can change how they see the world.
And it makes me think about the legal side of things, too. Could these claims about being exonerated because of divine intervention, could those be used against her in court? I mean, could it be seen as her trying to undermine the legal process or even sway potential jurors in future trials?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, she definitely has the right to her beliefs, but is it risky for her to be talking about them so publicly? Especially with more trials coming up. I wonder what legal experts would say about that.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear their take. This brings us back to the Dateline episode. And I'm really curious to hear what her son Colby had to say. He's the only one who can really give us some insight into what Lori's like and what her past is like.
Yeah, his perspective is going to be really important. It could help us understand her better. Did he see any red flags? Was there anything that happened before? That might explain why she is the way she is now. His interview is going to be really valuable. It'll add a much-needed human element to this whole story.
And that human element is so important, especially when you get into something as complicated as this case. It's easy to get caught up in all the legal stuff and the shocking details, but we can't forget that real people lost their lives and real families were torn apart.
You're absolutely right. The impact of this case on the victims and their families,
Yeah.
it's impossible to measure. We have to remember that as we go through all of this.
And speaking of the people affected by all of this, the Dateline episode also has interviews with retired FBI agent Doug Hart and the detectives who worked on the case. I bet their insights will be really valuable. They have so much experience and expertise.
Oh, for sure. They can tell us about the evidence,
Uh,
the investigation, and what it was like trying to uncover the truth. I'm especially interested to hear from Doug Hart. I mean, he has so much experience with criminal profiling and behavior analysis.
it really makes you realize how much work goes into these investigations, especially with a case as big and twisted as this one.
Definitely. And then you add in the religious extremism aspect and the possibility that people were being manipulated. And this has been incredibly difficult for law enforcement.
Absolutely. And speaking of religious extremism, it seems like Lori's beliefs played a huge role in this whole thing. In the article, she's quoted as saying, "I have seen things in the future that Jesus showed me when I was in heaven, and we were not in jail, and we were not in prison, and they were still in the future from now."
It's a powerful statement, especially when you combine it with all the other things she said about divine intervention and being exonerated. It really shows how much her belief system is influencing her. It makes you wonder about the role faith played in all of this. Did it push her to do these things? Did she use it to justify what she was doing? Or was it a way to protect herself from reality?
It's a really big question, and I'm sure a lot of people are trying to figure out the answer. How do we make sense of someone who seems to truly believe they were doing what God wanted, even when it ended up having such horrible consequences?
It's the question, isn't it? And it takes us way beyond just the legal aspects of the case. It gets into the psychology, the faith, and the mysteries of what makes us human.
It really does. It reminds us that this isn't just a court case or a true crime story. It's a look into the power of belief and the profound impact it can have on our actions and how we see the world. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive into the Lori Vallow Daybell case, what are your final thoughts? What really stood out to you the most?
It's been a wild ride for sure. We've talked about the crimes, Lori's claims of innocence, and how faith and belief play into all of this. It's a story that really leaves you with more questions than answers.
I agree with you on that. It definitely makes you question what you thought you knew about people and the power of belief. I mean, how do we reconcile the fact that she's been found guilty with the fact that she seems to truly believe in her own innocence?
It's the big question, isn't it? What happens when someone's personal beliefs go against the law and the idea of justice? And how do we deal with faith when it leads to such terrible outcomes?
You know, one thing that's become clear to me is that this case is so much bigger than just a court case or a true crime story. It's a human tragedy.
Yeah.
It's about real people who were affected by this in a huge way.
Absolutely. We have to remember the victims. Tylee, JJ, Tammy, and Charles. They're the ones who lost their lives, and their stories are the ones that really matter.
You're so right. It's easy to get lost in all the details and the psychology, but we can't forget about the real people who were hurt by this.
As we think about everything we've learned, it's important to think about the bigger picture, too. This case has sparked a lot of conversations about religious extremism, the justice system, and how the media shapes what people think. It forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that we all have.
It really does. It makes you realize that sometimes reality is even crazier than fiction. So knowing that Lori still has more trials to face and Chad's on death row, what are your final thoughts?
I think it's a powerful reminder that people are complex and that belief can be incredibly strong, even when all the evidence points in a different direction. This story isn't over yet, and I have a feeling there are going to be more surprises along the way.
I think you're right about that. Well, for everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the Lori Vallow Daybell case. It's a story that really makes you think about faith, justice, and what it means to be human.
And as you go forward, keep asking questions. Keep searching for the truth, no matter where it takes you.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.